Tony and I agreed that we could both well remember the 50s and thought it might be a good idea to ask a few friends to chat with me about what they remember of that time whilst Tony filmed the interviews. I started by asking them where they lived.
We had the ground floor, and then there was an old couple that seemed to us in the mezzanine floor, and then my grandparents lived in the top floor. There was a toilet on the mezzanine for those people upstairs, but our toilet was outside. Okay. There was no bathroom.
So my father died when I was little, and my mother and I lived in a 2 up and 2 down with no bathroom and an outside loo. I'd like to say we were without electricity, but in fact we had the electricity put in the last year of the 1940s, so I can't say that.
It was bleak, yes. It's a granite-built bungalow. It was quite big, I suppose, looking back at it now. It was in this little tin mining hamlet. There were only 11 dwellings there, a row of 6, once again, granite cottages. We had a dairy, which was one room in the bungalow, which was in the north corner, always very, very cold. It had marble slabs.
No. My first house was a sublet of a cold water flat, single end, in Anderson, which is probably the roughest area. People talk about the Gorbals, but Anderson is the toughest area. It was at 625 Argyle Street, which is just close to Anderson Cross. It was 2 stairs up. The toilet was on the half landing down from there, and the flat had, as they have traditionally in Scotland, a hole in the wall bed, which was, so to get to the point, you've got a fairly narrow opening in the wall where there's just enough room for a bed. There was a tiny little 1-ringed or 2-ringed stove, and there was a window onto that. In front of the window there was a sink, and that's all. There was no heating. There was a fire there, an electric fire, but that didn't work. So there was really no heating in the house, and we stayed there for a year.
Home was bitterly cold, a bad memory of my childhood. I was an asthma sufferer then, and the frost used to create ice on the inside of the bedroom windows.
So what sort of heating did you have?
Well, all we had a little stove in the kitchen. So this was a big house, but we lived in the kitchen because it was warm, and that heated the water. But we had no central heating at all, just that stove to heat the water.
We lived in a basement, and you had to go down steps to the front door, and there was bars across the windows, and we looked up and you could see people's feet walking on the pavement in front of you. We went out of there over to Durrant House.
Doreen is my sister, and like her, I remember the basement flat and giggling at people's funny feet as they passed by the window. Luckily, the Durrant house she refers to was a brand new block of council flats. All mild cons, bathroom, indoor loo, even a balcony. We were on the top floor. No more passing feet. It was 1952 and things were starting to improve, but we still had rationing.
Because one of the aunts here in Torquay ran a shop and had access to the shop and always got treated bar of chocolate, you know, I mean, wow. Whenever my mum came to see her sisters, we always saw Auntie Margaret, it was. Auntie Margaret always had a bar of sugar, a bar of chocolate for us.
I do remember going into Ashburton to the one grocer there. He was called Alf Dorr, And because he liked my red hair, he used to give me 1 extra sweet a week.
That's lovely.
But we also had a cooperative van that came round and drove up our path, parked outside the house, and Mum could buy things from there on the ration until 1954, I believe, wasn't it?
I mean, it was entirely different. There were no supermarkets, of course, no supermarkets at all. There were local shops. So second-hand shops were, but the other side, I mean, you could go into second-hand shops, have a look around and see what was what and what you could get for trifling sums of money. My mother made do. She went out to work full-time and made do. I was always fed. Never went hungry in my life. Well, never went hungry in my young life, anyway. And I must admit, I took that rather for granted.
For those of us still too young to be working, education was serious and an important step towards employment. I was lucky enough to have passed my 11 plus and just starting my time at a grammar school. I remember it for the discipline, the formality. Teachers wore their gowns all the time. School uniform was mandatory and expensive, and we were expected to gain a decent education. And that's something for which I have always been grateful.
I think boarding school was hard. I suppose we learnt to put, I know it was very emotional when the first night back at school after the holidays, but we were allowed to go home for 3 Sundays a term. We could be taken out, and that's when we had our chicken lunches. At Eagle House at prep school, we used to go for a school walk in a long caterpillar, and we were all taught that for ladies we had to take off our hats. So when we were going along in this long crocodile, everybody, when a woman came past, everyone would be taking their caps off. It was quite a sight, seeing the whole school out for a walk and everyone taking their cap off. I remember that.
There was a big black furnace, I suppose is the best way to describe it, where I don't know what sort of solid fuel was poured in at the top, and a lot of heat emanated out. But those at the front of the class felt that, those at the back didn't. When I first started, we didn't use pencils and paper. We used chalk and little miniature blackboards.
And I do remember the toilets, though. The toilets were outside, and they were wooden seats, and the water went underneath and swished away. You didn't have poor toilets. So if you were unfortunate sitting there when all of a sudden it was you get up, yeah.
So it was boys only, and the first day it was bullying. You were initiation service and it was bullying from day one. That was number one that sticks in my mind. And the second thing was the corporal punishment. It was unbelievable. From being in this lovely village school with Mrs. Morris, the cane was used all day, every day. And it was horrendous. I mean, boys beaten, cane on the hand, on the bottom. And I lived in fear a lot of the time. So you learnt by fear, you learnt things off. It was just horrendous, really.
With many families still struggling to make ends meet, further education was not an option for the average youngster. In fact, the expectation was that at the earliest opportunity, one found employment, earned money, and started to help with the family finances.
I had my first job and I worked in a ladies' dress shop, which was really boring because I thought it was going to be a nice job, and when it finished up, all I was doing was the ironing and brushing the dust from the front porch, and I didn't enjoy it at all. But I stayed there and then went on to work for the people next door who had a ladies' underwear and children's wear and knitting. And it was something that was much, much more interesting, I found. And I stayed there until after I was married.
I had to take passengers out and board them on an aircraft at Heathrow. And when I got to the aircraft with my passengers, the crew said, there are 2 people already on board. And I said, well, there's no one I've been advised that was being loaded prior to the rest of the passengers. So I went up to ask them to see their tickets. And they still had their airline ticket, their coupon in their ticket. So I said, how did you get here? Oh, the taxi dropped us here. So this is Heathrow Airport. There's the Queen's building and there's the terminal and there's a gap between with a barrier. And the chap on the barrier had gone for spend a penny and had left the barrier up. And the taxi had driven in. Can you tell me, mate, where the Paris is? And someone said, over there. And he dropped the passengers at the aircraft and they'd got on board and I had to take them off. I said, you can't travel. You have to come with me because you haven't cleared customs and immigration. In those days, you had to go through immigration and customs before you were allowed to board the aircraft. And I just thought that was a wonderful example of how security was in those days.
The chance of an apprenticeship was one that I was told could not be missed, because people had to pay for apprenticeships unless they were privileged. And my privilege was that my father was a charge hand blacksmith. So that, in the gradings of the old GWR, meant that I was entitled to a first-class trade. Never mind about whether I had any interest in engineering, any inclination or capacity. If my father had the right job, I could have a trade. So at 21, I finished my apprenticeship, and then 3 weeks later, into the army I went.
In 1953, whilst some of us were at school and some of us at work, no one could have been unaware of the coronation. On the estate where we lived, preparations seemed to go on for months for a big party in the community centre. And my sister had the job of going weekly round all 6 blocks of apartments, collecting 6p a week per child to pay for food, bunting and a china mug for the big day. I really don't remember much of the party, but I do know that I couldn't wait to get to the cinema the next day to see the spectacle on the news, and I probably saw it more than once.
There was all these special trains full of children, and then you had your space. It was obviously well organised, and you had your space on the Mall. I remember the coach coming by with the Queen in it, but the one that really stuck in my mind was Queen Saloti of Tonga, because it was raining. She still had her thing open, and she was a huge lady, and she went by like this, and we're all cheering because we could really see her. And that's the one I remember. I don't remember any of the others, but I remember her.
My mum and I and my dad, we all went to the village hall to watch the coronation on a television. And the television was one of these wooden ones with a small screen, and there must have been 100 of us crammed into this parish hall. And I got fairly near the front because I was quite small. And I do remember seeing the coronation on the television.
Coming up to the coronation, the gardener at the big house that owned the farm that my father was managing, the gardener had a television. I don't think everybody had a television in those days, but he had a television, and he invited me to go and watch the coronation on his television.
Nobody close to us had a television, but I did have a red, white and blue ribbon in my hair. And that was for the coronation in 1953, because that was sent to me by one of my aunties. And I remember that was lovely because I could wear it to school.
And somehow or other we came to an arrangement that we would have a battle with the Young Conservatives outside the town hall, with throwing flower bombs and soot bombs and things like that at each other. We were going to go down in front of the town hall, and the Young Conservatives would ambush us with whatever they'd got, which they were going to throw at us, anything that wasn't life-threatening. It tipped down with rain. God. And we were a bedraggled lot. So that is my greatest memory of the coronation.
Holidays, if taken at all, were simple and inexpensive. I can remember reading about the Canary Islands and knowing that holidays there were strictly for the rich and famous. A week at a holiday camp when I was 16 felt daring and exciting, although, as Josephine will tell you, they were pretty basic.
Yeah, before I went abroad, went to holiday camps. So yeah, it had been.
Holiday camps like?
I think they were old places where, certainly the one I went to, where the troops had been during the war. You know, it's a little hut.
We went to see my grandparents, both of whom, grandparents on my dad's side, both of whom lived in Lymington in the same house for 93 years in the end. They both died when they were 93, but that was just a 2-up, 2-down terrace cottage, tiny. And we used to go and stay, because it was a long journey. It took over 8 hours in Dad's car in those days. We stayed overnight and then came home the next day. So that was our annual holiday, if you like.
Yeah.
My father was in a wheelchair, so there was real difficulty on going on holiday, because to go in a wheelchair you had to get a train. My dad and I did that on a couple of occasions, and we sat in the gas van, so we'd end up in the gas van. My mother would sit in the carriage and we'd sit in the gas van. But we would only go somewhere within probably an hour's run of Glasgow. And I certainly have got memories of my mother and I going to find the boarding house where we were going to be staying for a week, and my mother taking a tape measure to measure the doors, that the wheelchair could get through the doors into the house itself and into the room. So that was quite critical, because we had, apparently, I didn't remember it, made one trip to Largs, and when she got there, the wheelchair couldn't get through the door. So eventually I think she lost her money that time. We just turned around and came back home again.
Finally, I asked everyone to sum up their life in the 50s, and you may be surprised at the positive responses.
You were younger, of course, then. That was one of the big benefits. You were younger. So all the health issues that you have in later years, you didn't have. No, I had a pretty happy life in many ways.
It didn't matter that we were poor. We didn't know we were poor, but I think we enjoyed life.
You didn't have many choices in those days about where your life was going to go or what you were going to do. You expected you were going to go to work and help with the family.
Being the son of a farmer and plenty of land over which to shoot and plenty of rabbits to shoot and dogs to train, and that was centred around, I suppose, the 1952 coronation.
The early years, happy years, really, despite being lonely years. Didn't enjoy the middle education years. So the memories are really that the cold in the 50s. I do remember that.
There's a lot of things that people get now and they haven't got the same valuation on things.
The 50s is where we were. That was life. And it didn't seem to me mostly to be a bad life.
For me, I think it was a time when we made the most of what we had and we had few expectations. But by the end of the decade, we had started to have positive aspirations for the future.